My mom kissed my forehead, handed me one crumpled 20, and walked out the door for a month in Europe, like I was a houseplant she could water later. I was 11. No babysitter. No neighbor told. No food plan. And the emergency card she left didn't even work. By day 5, the fridge was empty. My head spun when I stood up, and I realized something terrifying. If something happened to me, nobody would even know. If you're interested in this gist, hit the like button, subscribe, and type "interested" in the comments. And I will give you a heart. My name is Sydney, and I need you to picture this clearly because the details matter. It was a bright summer morning, the kind that looks normal from the outside. Birds, warm light, a quiet street. Inside our house, my mom was dragging a suitcase down the hallway with a smile that did not match what she was doing. She stopped at the door, held out a crumpled 20 like it was a prize, and said, "See? You're independent now. You're not a baby anymore. Just order food if you need to." I remember staring at the bill in my palm and waiting for the rest of the sentence. The part where she tells me who's coming to check on me, what I should do if something goes wrong, what to eat, how to reach her. But there wasn't a rest. There was just a fake kiss on my forehead, a bright, breezy, "I'll be back before you know it," and the sound of wheels scraping over the driveway. The front door shut, and it felt like the whole house exhaled and left me behind. I said out loud, "I'll be fine," to an empty hallway, like saying it could make it true. My hands were shaking. I walked back into the kitchen and tried to act like this was some kind of test I could pass. I opened the fridge. Half empty. A couple containers with leftovers I didn't trust. Some milk that looked like it had been there too long, and a few sad slices of cheese. I opened the pantry. A few cans, some cereal, peanut butter, and random things that didn't make a meal unless you were pretending. I told myself, okay, I'll stretch it. I'll make it work. I'll show her she's right, that I'm mature. That word sat in my stomach like a rock because it wasn't a compliment. It was a way to make her feel less guilty. The first real problem hit 10 minutes later. On the counter, my mom had tossed down a shiny emergency credit card like it solved everything. So I grabbed my phone and tried to order food the way she told me to. I typed in the card. Declined. I typed it again. Declined. I tried a different app. Declined. I checked the card number twice. Then 3 times, sweating like I'd done something wrong. Finally, I called the number on the back of the card and got an automated voice asking for the PIN. I didn't know it. I tried the only numbers I could guess. My birthday, her birthday, the house number. Wrong. Locked. That was when it hit me. The card wasn't activated, and even if it was, I didn't have the information to use it. I was standing in the kitchen with a dead card, a phone that couldn't help me, and one wrinkled 20 that suddenly looked smaller than it had 5 minutes earlier. I didn't cry. Not yet. I turned it into a game because games make panic feel manageable. I made a peanut butter sandwich and sliced the bread thin, like I'd seen people do in survival videos. I poured cereal carefully like each piece was a coin. I told myself day 1 is easy. Day 1 is always easy. I even laughed once, quietly, like maybe this would be something I'd joke about later. Remember when Mom left me alone and I became a mini adult? The laugh sounded wrong in the empty room. By day 2, the house started sounding alive in ways I didn't like. Every creak felt like a footstep. Every little pop in the walls made me freeze. I kept the TV on just for noise. Not because I cared what was playing, but because silence was loud. I kept checking my phone for messages, even though I knew she was on a plane or landing somewhere glamorous. Somewhere with croissants and shiny streets, and people who didn't have to think about a kid alone in a kitchen counting cereal. I told myself she would call when she settled in. She didn't. I told myself she'd text. She didn't. I told myself maybe it was time zones. Maybe she was busy. Maybe she assumed I was fine. The worst part was realizing she didn't need proof that I was okay. She needed the story that I was okay. Those are different things, and once you learn that, you can't unlearn it. By day 3, food stopped being an inconvenience and turned into fear. The pantry looked like a sad joke. A couple cans I didn't know how to open without risking a cut. A box of cereal that was more air than food. A jar of pickles I hated. Peanut butter. But peanut butter doesn't fix everything when you're 11 and your stomach is hollow. My stomach growled so loud it embarrassed me, even though there was nobody there to hear it. That's how lonely it was. You get embarrassed in an empty room. That day, I opened my mom's laptop because I didn't know what else to do. I saw her emails stacked up like bricks, messages from work, reminders, travel confirmations, reservations. She had planned her trip down to the hour. Flights, hotels, tours. She planned Europe like it mattered. She didn't plan me. I closed the laptop and felt something shift inside me, like a switch flipped from I'll survive to I will remember. I grabbed my notebook from my backpack and wrote one word at the top in big letters. Evidence. My handwriting looked shaky, but I wrote anyway. Left alone at 11. Given $20. Emergency card doesn't work. No babysitter. No check-ins. I didn't fully know why I wrote it. I just knew that adults love to rewrite reality when they get caught. They say things like, "That's not what happened," and "You're being dramatic," and "You must have misunderstood." Writing it down made me feel less crazy. It made me feel like I could hold on to the truth, even if someone tried to shake it out of me later. Then I did something that scared me. I opened the camera on my phone. I propped it up against a cup on the counter, pressed record, and stared at my own face. I looked smaller than I expected, like my cheeks had already thinned in just a few days. Day 3, I said quietly. I'm still alone. My voice sounded too calm, like I was reporting weather. The card doesn't work. The food is running out. I paused, swallowing. If you're seeing this, it means someone finally asked what happened to me. I stopped recording and saved it. Part of me hoped nobody would ever see it. Another part of me wanted it to hit my mom like a slap when she came home, because I was already tired of being the person who had to quietly endure things to keep other people comfortable. By day 5, the hunger turned physical in a way I didn't know could happen. It wasn't just, "I'm hungry." It was dizzy when I stood up. It was my brain feeling slow like fog. It was my stomach clenching so hard it felt like cramping. I found a half-empty cereal bag shoved in the back of the cupboard and ate it dry with my hands, trying to make each handful last. Then I wrote again in the notebook. Day 5. No call. No text. Not even "Did you eat?" I wrote another line under it without thinking, and when I read it back, my throat tightened. If I disappear, this proves it wasn't my fault. I didn't even know where the thought came from, but once it existed, it wouldn't leave. That was the moment the story stopped being about me making it until she came home. It became about what would happen to her when someone finally saw what she'd done. I looked out the front window on day 7 and watched the street like a stranger. Kids rode bikes. A dog barked. Someone carried groceries into their house. Normal people living normal lives. I pressed my hand to the glass and whispered, "You chose Europe over me. Do you understand what that's going to cost you when someone finds out?" And then, like the universe had been listening, the doorbell rang. I froze so hard my whole body went cold. Nobody rang our doorbell. Packages got left. Neighbors knocked. The bell rang again, then 3 sharp knocks. My heart hammered. I thought about staying silent. I thought about hiding and pretending I wasn't home. But another thought cut through the fear like a bright blade. What if this is the moment someone finally sees me? I wiped cereal dust off my fingers, walked to the door and cracked it open. A man stood on the porch wearing a green jacket with my school emblem stitched on the chest. It took my brain a second to place him without a hallway full of students behind him. "Hi, Sydney," he said gently. "It's Mr. Hughes. I've been trying to reach your parents. They haven't answered. Can I come in for a moment?" My first instinct was to lie, to protect them, to say my parents were busy, they'd be right back, everything was fine. That's what kids like me learn to do early, keep the story clean so the adults don't get mad. But my hand loosened on the doorknob. I stepped back and opened the door wider. "Sure," I murmured. I guess. He stepped inside, and the quiet of the house suddenly felt like a spotlight. He looked around, and I knew what he saw even before he said anything. The empty counter, the stale air, the sink with dishes I'd been too weak to wash, the fridge that wasn't stocked. He asked, "Are your parents at work?" And I surprised myself with how flat my voice sounded when I answered, "They're in Europe." His eyebrows lifted. "Europe? For how long?" I swallowed. This was the line. The moment everything changed depending on what I said next. "A month," I admitted. "And who is staying with you?" he asked, and his voice was still calm, but I saw the concern shift into something sharper. I stared at my notebook on the table. The word evidence stared back at me like it was daring me to tell the truth. "Just me," I said. "They said I was old enough." Something in his face changed, like a switch flipping. He pulled out a chair and sat, motioning for me to sit across from him. "Sydney," he said gently, "how long have you been alone?" "Almost a week," I whispered. "Do you have enough food? Enough money?" I let out a small laugh I didn't recognize. "They left me $20 and a card that doesn't work." He stared at me for a long moment, then said the sentence that made my heart thud in my ears. "This is not okay. This is dangerous. This is neglect." That word hit hard. Neglect. It sounded like something that happened to other kids, kids on TV. Not kids in neighborhoods where people waved and mowed lawns and pretended everything was fine. Then he asked, "Do you want help? Real help. The kind that makes sure this never happens again." I looked down at my hands, then back up at him, and my voice came out steadier than I felt. "Yes," I said. "But if I say yes, what happens to them?" Mr. Hughes didn't lie to make me feel better. He said, "It means they will have to answer for what they did, and it means you won't have to carry this alone anymore." And in that moment, I realized the next problem wasn't hunger or money or a dead card. The next problem was bigger. My parents were going to come back expecting their perfect story, and they were about to walk into proof that could destroy the version of themselves they loved more than they loved me. Mr. Hughes didn't waste time once I said yes. He stepped into the hallway, lowered his voice, and made a call that sounded like it came from a place adults reserve for emergencies. I couldn't hear every word, but the pieces that drifted back were enough to make my stomach tighten. 11 years old, unsupervised, no guardian, food insecurity, parents out of the country. Hearing it said out loud like that made it real in a way my notebook never could. It wasn't just my fear anymore. It was a situation, a problem with a name. And the moment a problem has a name, people start taking sides. He came back to the kitchen and looked at me like I was someone he was responsible for now, not just a student passing through his office once a semester. "First," he said, calm but firm, "we're going to get you fed. Second, you are not sleeping here alone tonight." The word alone hit like a bruise. I nodded even though my throat felt tight. I didn't want to cry in front of him. I hated the idea of looking small. But my body was already betraying me, my hands trembling, my head feeling floaty like I was standing on a boat. Mr. Hughes glanced at the pantry and fridge without making a big show of it. That gentleness mattered. He didn't want to humiliate me. He wanted to fix the problem. "Do you have a neighbor you trust?" he asked. My brain scrambled for names. I knew faces. I knew who waved, who watered plants, who got packages. But trust is different when you realize your mom didn't tell anyone you were alone. Then I remembered Mrs. Johnson next door, the older woman who always smelled like vanilla and wore gardening gloves like jewelry. She'd once brought cookies over at Christmas and told me I had polite eyes. I didn't know what that meant, but she'd said it like it mattered. "Mrs. Johnson," I said quietly. "Okay," Mr. Hughes replied. "I'm calling her." I wanted to stop him. I wanted to say no, don't involve anyone, don't make this bigger. Because bigger meant consequences, and consequences meant my mom's anger. I'd lived my whole life learning how to predict her mood, like weather. But I also remembered day 5, dizziness, the empty shelves, the word evidence. I didn't stop him. A few minutes later, there was a soft knock, not the sharp kind that scares you. The door opened, and Mrs. Johnson stepped in like she belonged, like she'd always been the kind of adult who shows up. Her eyes swept over the kitchen and landed on me. I watched her expression change, not into shock, but into worry so strong it looked like pain. "Oh, Sydney," she breathed. "Honey, why didn't you come to me?" The question made heat crawl up my neck. Because I didn't want to look weak. Because my mom always said I was mature. Because if I asked for help, it meant she was wrong, and she hates being wrong. The truth came out messier. "I thought I was supposed to handle it," I blurted. She said, "I'm independent now." Mrs. Johnson's mouth tightened. Mr. Hughes didn't say anything, just watched her, and I could tell they were having an adult conversation without words. "Independent doesn't mean abandoned," Mrs. Johnson said, soft but sharp. "And hungry isn't a lesson." That sentence made my eyes sting. Hungry isn't a lesson. My mom would have called it character building. Mrs. Johnson called it what it was. Mr. Hughes pulled a chair out and sat down again. "Sydney," he said, "I need you to answer honestly, okay? When was the last time your mom called you?" I swallowed. "The airport," I admitted. She texted a selfie from Paris with a heart emoji after that. Mrs. Johnson stared at me like she couldn't believe it. "No calls? No check-ins?" "No," I whispered. Mr. Hughes took out a notepad and started writing, but not in a scary way. In a, "I'm making sure nobody can twist this later" way. And that's when my notebook on the table caught Mrs. Johnson's eye. Evidence was still written at the top in thick letters. She looked at it, then at me, then back at it, like she was seeing a child forced into a job no child should have. "You wrote this?" she asked gently. I nodded. My voice got small. I didn't know what else to do. Mr. Hughes leaned forward. "Can you show us what you wrote, Sydney? Only what you're comfortable sharing." My hands shook as I opened the pages. There it was. Dates, notes, the dead card, the money, the food disappearing, the silence. And the line I hadn't meant to write, but did anyway. "If I disappear, this proves it wasn't my fault." Mrs. Johnson's face went pale. "Sweetheart," she whispered, "no kid should be thinking that." I didn't know how to answer, because I didn't want to be dramatic. I just wanted someone to understand why a kid would write that. Mr. Hughes cleared his throat, his voice low. "This is enough for me to call for immediate support." He looked at Mrs. Johnson. "Would you be willing to have Sydney stay with you tonight?" Mrs. Johnson didn't hesitate. "Of course." My chest tightened again, but this time it wasn't fear. It was relief, mixed with shame. I didn't want to be rescued like a lost pet. I wanted parents who didn't leave, but I couldn't undo what they'd done. I could only survive what came next. Mr. Hughes turned to me. "We're also contacting Child Protective Services. This doesn't mean you're in trouble. It means adults with authority will make sure you're safe." Authority. That word made my stomach flip. "Are they going to take me away?" I asked. Mr. Hughes looked me in the eye. "Right now, we're making sure you're supervised and fed. After that, they decide next steps. But understand this, Sydney. None of this is because you did something wrong." Mrs. Johnson nodded. "It's because your mom did." I should have felt guilty hearing that. Instead, I felt something like a quiet fire. Because for once, someone said it plainly. We moved fast after that. Mrs. Johnson went back to her house and returned with grocery bags like she was preparing for a storm. Pasta, sauce, bread, eggs, fruit, yogurt, soups, real food. The smell of fresh groceries, that clean, cold smell from the fridge items, made my mouth water so hard it almost hurt. I hated how my body reacted like I'd been starving in the wilderness instead of in a nice house in a nice neighborhood. Mrs. Johnson didn't shame me for it. She acted like feeding a kid was the most normal thing in the world. Because it is. While she put things away, Mr. Hughes asked for my mom's name, her number, her workplace, travel details. He asked for the flight confirmation if I had it. I didn't. My mom had printed everything and taken it with her. Of course she had. Mr. Hughes asked, "Do you have access to her email?" I hesitated. "Her laptop is in the living room." He nodded. "We're not snooping. We're finding contact and verifying where they are." The difference mattered. Snooping is what kids get accused of. Verifying is what adults do when a child might be at risk. Mrs. Johnson made spaghetti. Real spaghetti, not microwave cups. The sauce sizzled. Garlic popped in the pan. It smelled like safety. When she put a bowl in front of me, steam curling into my face, my eyes burned again. I took the first bite, and my whole body relaxed in a way I didn't realize it had been tense for days. Food isn't just food when you've been rationing cereal like it's currency. It's proof you're allowed to exist. While I ate, the caseworker arrived. She introduced herself as Ms. Lopez, calm voice, neutral face, a clipboard tucked under her arm like it belonged there. She asked permission to look around the house. Mr. Hughes said yes. Mrs. Johnson said yes. I wanted to say yes too, like I had any authority, but my throat was full of pasta and emotions. Ms. Lopez opened the fridge, the pantry, looked at the dead card on the counter, the crumbs, the empty shelves. She didn't gasp. She didn't scold. She just wrote things down, and the seriousness of her silence made my heart pound. "How long have your parents been gone?" she asked. 7 days, I said. They planned a month. "And who checks on you?" "No one," I answered. "Until today." "Do they call?" "No," I said again. "Just a selfie." Ms. Lopez's pen paused for half a second, and that tiny pause felt like a verdict. Then she asked something that made my skin prickle. "Sydney, do you want to leave a statement for your parents?" My fork froze midair. A statement, like a court, like evidence. My notebook sat there, open, like it had been waiting for this question. I swallowed. "Yes," I said. "I want them to know exactly what this felt like." Ms. Lopez nodded. "Write it in your own words." Mrs. Johnson slid me paper. Mr. Hughes sat quietly like he was guarding the room. I wrote with my hand still shaky, but the words came out clear. "You said I was independent, but you left me alone. You left me with $20 and a card that doesn't work. You didn't call. You didn't check. I ate dry cereal and tried not to be scared. Other adults saw what you did. If there are consequences, it's because you left me, not because I told the truth." I handed it to Ms. Lopez and felt something strange settle over me. Not happiness, not peace, but certainty. The new problem wasn't whether I could survive until my mom came back. The new problem was what would happen when she realized the truth had already escaped her control. The night I slept at Mrs. Johnson's house was the first night in a week that my body actually rested, and that alone terrified me. I lay in the guest room staring at the ceiling fan as it turned slow circles, thinking about how quickly my muscles had learned what safety felt like again. That scared me more than the hunger had, because it meant I had been living in something unsafe long enough for it to feel normal. Mrs. Johnson had left the door cracked open and a small lamp on in the hallway, like she was afraid the dark itself might hurt me. I didn't close the door. I didn't want to feel shut away anymore. At some point in the night, I woke up disoriented, my heart racing, convinced for half a second that I'd hear my mom's voice calling from the hallway, annoyed, asking why I was still awake. Instead, I heard the quiet hum of a refrigerator that was actually full. I heard the soft ticking of a clock that wasn't counting down to my parents' return, but just marking time like clocks are supposed to. I pressed my face into the pillow and cried silently, not loud, not dramatic, just enough to let it out. Because once the adults knew, once the notebook was copied and the statements written, there was no going back. The next morning, Ms. Lopez returned early. She sat at the kitchen table with her folder open and spoke in the calm, careful way adults use when they are trying not to scare a kid, even though the situation itself is scary. "Your parents have been notified," she said. "They were surprised." I almost laughed at that. Surprised felt like a weak word for what they were probably feeling. They said you were exaggerating, she continued, watching my face closely. That you're mature, that they trusted you. Mrs. Johnson made a quiet sound of disapproval from the stove. Ms. Lopez raised a hand gently. That's common, she said. When adults realize their choices are being questioned, they try to reframe them. Reframe. That word stuck. My mom loved reframing things. Forgetting a birthday became being busy. Canceling plans became flexibility. Leaving me alone became independence. They're flying home earlier, Ms. Lopez said next. 3 days from now. My stomach dropped. 3 days. I had imagined weeks to prepare myself, to get stronger, to hide the shaking in my hands. Instead, everything accelerated. Mrs. Johnson reached over and squeezed my shoulder. You're not alone, she said. Not this time. At school. Word spread faster than I expected. Not the details, but the feeling. Teachers looked at me differently, softer, like they were afraid of stepping wrong. Mr. Hughes walked me to class and back like he was guarding something fragile. Kids whispered. Some asked if I was sick. Others asked if I was in trouble. I told them nothing. My story was no longer cafeteria gossip. It was an adult problem now. That afternoon, Ms. Lopez asked if I wanted to record another video statement, something clear and calm, not emotional. This isn't to hurt your parents, she said. It's to make sure your voice is preserved without interruption. I sat at Mrs. Johnson's table with my notebook open and my phone propped up against a mug. I took a breath and spoke slowly. My name is Sydney. I am 11. My mom left me alone for a month. She gave me $20 and a credit card that didn't work. She didn't call to check if I was okay. I was hungry. I was scared. I wrote everything down because I didn't want anyone to say I was lying. I'm not trying to get revenge. I'm trying to be safe. When I stopped recording, my hands were steady. That surprised me. That night, my mom called again. This time, her voice wasn't sharp. It was frantic. Ms. Lopez put the phone on speaker. Sydney, my mom said, breathless. Why didn't you tell me things were this bad? I stared at the phone like it was something alive. I did, I said. Before you left, I asked who would stay with me. Silence stretched. You didn't say you were starving, she replied finally. Mrs. Johnson leaned forward. Children shouldn't have to say they're starving for adults to check on them, she said. My mom snapped back. This is between me and my daughter. Ms. Lopez cut in calmly. It isn't anymore. This is now a safety matter. The call ended badly, with my mom crying and my dad shouting in the background about overreach and misunderstandings. I felt oddly detached afterward, like the call confirmed something I already knew. They weren't scared for me. They were scared of consequences. The next problem came the following day. Ms. Lopez explained that temporary placement meant rules. Supervised contact only. No private calls. No unscheduled visits. This is to protect you, she said, but it may make your parents angry. Angry didn't cover it. That evening, my dad showed up at the edge of Mrs. Johnson's driveway. He didn't knock. He stood there with his arms crossed like he owned the sidewalk. Mrs. Johnson went out first, phone in hand. You need to leave, she said firmly. Any contact goes through the department. He pointed past her, his voice tight. Sydney, get over here. We need to talk. My heart hammered, but I stayed inside. I didn't move. For the first time in my life, I didn't respond to his command. Ms. Lopez arrived minutes later. Lights flashing softly, not like a police chase, but like a warning. My dad argued. He demanded. He insisted they were good parents. Ms. Lopez didn't raise her voice. She just repeated the rules. When he finally left, his tires screeching, I felt something settle deep in my chest. I had crossed a line. And once crossed, lines don't move back just because someone yells. The day before they returned, Ms. Lopez prepared me for what would happen. We'll meet them at your house, she said. There will be a supervisor present. You can speak if you want, or you can let the adults speak. I thought about hiding in Mrs. Johnson's kitchen while they faced the mess alone. Then I thought about my notebook, the word evidence, the videos. I want to be there, I said. I don't want them to talk about me like I'm not in the room. Ms. Lopez nodded. Then we'll make sure you're heard. That night I couldn't sleep. My mind replayed memories I hadn't thought about in years. Being left alone after school. Being praised for not needing help. Being told not to bother adults with my feelings. It all lined up now, like clues I hadn't known to collect. Independence had never been about trusting me. It had been about not wanting to be bothered. The morning of their return, we went back to my house. It felt smaller than I remembered. Colder, like it had been waiting, holding its breath. Ms. Lopez placed her folder on the table. Mrs. Johnson stood near the doorway. Mr. Hughes leaned against the counter. My phone was propped up again. The first video paused on the screen. When the car pulled in, my hand shook, but I didn't step back. The door opened. My mom walked in first, suitcase rolling, smile already forming like she expected a hug. It died instantly when she saw us. "What is this?" she demanded. "Why are all these people here?" Ms. Lopez introduced herself. Calm, clear, official. My mom's eyes darted to me. "Sydney, tell them this is a misunderstanding." I took a breath. "It isn't," I said. My dad scoffed. "This is ridiculous. She's fine. She's always been fine." Ms. Lopez slid the photos across the table. The fridge, the pantry, the dead card. My mom's face drained of color. "You took pictures of my house?" she whispered. "We documented the conditions your child was living in," Ms. Lopez replied. "We documented neglect." My mom shook her head. No, this can't be happening." I thought of her words from the airport. "You are independent now." This time, I didn't feel small hearing her panic. I felt taller. "You always said actions have consequences," I said quietly. "This is yours." The room went silent. My dad looked at me like he didn't recognize me. Maybe he didn't. Maybe the version of me that stayed quiet and grateful was gone. Ms. Lopez explained the next steps. Temporary placement, supervised visits, court hearing. My mom cried. My dad argued. None of it changed the outcome. When we left the house, I didn't look back. That was the new problem I hadn't expected. Walking away without looking back hurt in a way Sting never had. But it also felt honest. That night, back at Mrs. Johnson's, I added a final line to my notebook. They came home. They saw the truth. I'm not invisible anymore. And for the first time since my mom closed that door behind her, I believed it. The first week after my parents came home didn't feel like a victory or a relief. It felt like standing in the quiet after something breaks and realizing the sound is never coming back the same way. I stayed with Mrs. Johnson under the temporary placement order, and everyone kept saying words like stable and transitional, but nothing about it felt temporary in my body. My routine changed overnight. Breakfast at the table instead of scavenging. Rides to school instead of walking with my head down. Adults asking questions and waiting for the answers instead of deciding what was true for me. That should have felt comforting. But instead it made me restless, because every time someone asked how I felt, it reminded me that for 11 years no one really had. The new problem came fast. My parents weren't allowed to contact me directly, but that didn't stop them from trying to reach me through other people. Teachers pulled me aside with uncomfortable looks. A distant aunt sent a message to Mrs. Johnson saying my mother was devastated and not herself. Someone else said my parents were telling everyone I had been influenced, that I'd misunderstood the situation, that I was too sensitive. The story was already being rewritten. And this time it wasn't happening in my house, it was happening everywhere. Ms. Lopez warned me about it gently. When adults lose control of the narrative, they look for a way to take it back, she said. That can feel confusing and painful, especially when it comes from family. Confusing didn't even begin to cover it. I started having dreams where my mom stood in my doorway smiling, telling me everything was fine, while the fridge behind her emptied itself again and again. I'd wake up sweating, my heart racing, half convinced I was still alone. Mrs. Johnson noticed before I said anything. "You're sleeping with your light on," she said one morning, not accusing, just observing. I shrugged. "I like it." She didn't push. That made it easier to breathe. At school, the counselor scheduled regular check-ins. Mr. Hughes asked me questions I didn't have answers for yet. "Do you miss them?" he asked once. I stared at the carpet. I miss the idea of them," I said finally. "I miss parents who would have stayed." He nodded like that made sense, because it did. The court date loomed closer, and with it came another problem I hadn't expected. I was asked if I wanted to speak, not just in a recorded statement, but in front of a judge, my parents, and strangers who would decide where I belonged. The thought made my stomach twist. Ms. Lopez explained it carefully. "You're not required to," she said, "but sometimes it helps the court understand what the reports can't fully show." I thought about my mom crying in the kitchen, my dad yelling in the driveway, the way both of them looked at me like I'd become something dangerous. "If I speak," I asked, "will they listen?" Ms. Lopez met my eyes. "Yes," she said, "they will have to." That night, I sat at Mrs. Johnson's table with my notebook open, staring at the word evidence like it was daring me to stop. I started writing again, not facts this time, but feelings. How quiet the house had been, how loud my stomach sounded at night, how I'd learned to drink water to trick myself into feeling full, how scary it was to realize I could disappear and no one would notice until it was inconvenient. Writing it made my hands shake, but it also made my thoughts line up in a way they never had before. This wasn't about punishment. It was about being seen. The next call from my parents came through Ms. Lopez's office. Supervised, timed, controlled. My mom's face filled the screen, eyes red, hair pulled back like she hadn't slept. "Sydney," she said softly, like saying my name gently could undo everything. "We're getting help. We're taking classes. We just want you to come home." My dad sat beside her, arms crossed, jaw tight. "This has gone too far," he said. "We made a mistake, not a crime." I felt the familiar urge to smooth things over, to make it easier for everyone. It was the role I'd played my whole life. But something had shifted. "You didn't make one mistake," I said. "You made a lot of choices, and I lived with them." My mom's eyes filled. "We trusted you," she whispered. "You always seemed so capable." I looked at her through the screen. "I was capable because I had to be," I said, "not because it was good for me." The call ended with promises and apologies that felt heavy and unfinished. Afterward, I felt drained, like I'd run a race without moving. Mrs. Johnson made hot chocolate and didn't ask me to talk. That helped more than anything. The court hearing arrived sooner than I was ready for. The room smelled like paper and old coffee, just like I'd imagined. My parents sat at one table, dressed carefully, like appearance could rewrite history. Ms. Lopez sat beside me, calm and steady. When it was my turn to speak, my legs felt weak, but my voice didn't disappear. I talked about being left alone, about the money, about the card that didn't work, about the nights I'd eaten cereal for dinner and pretended it was a choice. I talked about writing things down because I was scared no one would believe me. My mom cried openly. My dad stared straight ahead. The judge listened without interrupting. When I finished, the room felt lighter and heavier at the same time. The ruling came later. Supervised visits only. Mandatory counseling. Parenting classes. Temporary custody remained with Mrs. Johnson. It wasn't permanent, but it wasn't nothing. My parents looked stunned, like they'd expected the world to snap back into place once adults got involved. Instead, it had shifted around them. Another problem emerged in the weeks that followed. People treated me differently. Some teachers were extra gentle. Some kids avoided me. Others asked invasive questions. Did your parents really leave you? Are they bad people? I didn't know how to answer without feeling like I was betraying someone. Mr. Hughes helped me find words. You can say it was complicated, he told me. Or you can say it's not something you want to talk about. Learning I was allowed to not explain myself was new and uncomfortable. At home, Mrs. Johnson gave me space to be a kid again, but even that felt strange. When she asked if I wanted help with homework, my first instinct was to say no. When she reminded me to eat, I felt embarrassed. Independence had been drilled into me so deeply that care felt like a test I was failing. One evening, she sat across from me and said something that stuck. You don't have to earn care, she said. It's not a reward for being easy. I didn't know what to say to that. The supervised visits started shortly after. A small room, a neutral adult present. My parents tried hard. Too hard. My mom brought snacks and games like she was trying to recreate something that never really existed. My dad was quieter, watching me like I might vanish. Every visit left me exhausted. I felt guilty for not feeling grateful. Ms. Lopez checked in after each one. How did it feel? She asked. Confusing, I said every time. Because it was. The biggest new problem came one night when I overheard my parents arguing during a visit. My mom said she felt punished. My dad said the system was against them. Neither of them said my name. That hurt more than anything else. It told me they were still focused on themselves. Back at Mrs. Johnson's, I wrote one more entry. They're sorry for what happened to them, not for what happened to me. Writing it made my chest ache, but it also made things clear. I wasn't wrong for protecting myself. As weeks passed, something unexpected happened. I started laughing again. Not the polite kind, but the kind that surprises you. I joined a small after-school club. I cooked dinner with Mrs. Johnson and actually enjoyed it. The constant knot in my stomach loosened, just enough for me to notice it had been there at all. One afternoon, Ms. Lopez asked me a question I hadn't considered. If the court decides reunification is possible someday, what would you need to feel safe? I thought about it for a long time. I'd need them to stop calling neglect independence, I said. I'd need them to check on me because they want to, not because they're told to. And I need to know that if I said I wasn't okay, they wouldn't leave. She nodded and wrote it down. That felt powerful in a quiet way. My parents continued their classes. They sent letters through the department, carefully worded, apologetic, hopeful. I read them slowly. Some parts felt sincere. Others felt familiar, like the same reframing with better language. I didn't respond right away. I was learning that silence didn't always mean weakness. Sometimes it meant thinking. One evening, as I sat on Mrs. Johnson's porch watching the sun go down, I realized something that scared and comforted me at the same time. Even if my parents never truly understood what they'd done, I was going to be okay. Not because I was independent, but because I finally wasn't alone. That realization brought a new kind of grief. Grief for the parents I wished I'd had. Grief for the kid who learned too early how to disappear. But it also brought something else. Control. Not over them, but over me. And as the weeks turned into months, that control felt less like revenge and more like survival done right. The next problem didn't announce itself with shouting or court papers. It arrived quietly in the form of expectations, and it was harder to fight because it wore a friendly face. After the hearing, everyone seemed to agree on one thing without ever asking me. I was resilient. Teachers said it with pride. Social workers said it with relief. Relatives said it like it erased everything else. She's strong, they'd whisper, as if strength meant the damage had expired. The truth was Messier. Strength didn't mean I wasn't still flinching when doors closed too loudly or checking the pantry before bed. Strength didn't stop my hands from shaking when my mom's handwriting appeared on an envelope forwarded through the department. But now that I'd spoken up once, people expected me to be finished with it. That expectation became its own pressure. At school, I was praised for maturity and composure, and every compliment felt like a trap. If I ever cried, would that mean I wasn't coping after all? If I asked for help, would they decide I wasn't as okay as they'd told the court? One afternoon, a substitute teacher pulled me aside and said, "You're such a brave girl. I don't know how you do it." I smiled automatically, then spent the rest of the day feeling hollow. Brave sounded too close to fine. Fine was what got me left alone. The supervised visits continued, and with them came a new tension. My parents were trying to say the right things now. My mom apologized often, sometimes too often, like repetition could substitute for understanding. My dad talked about schedules and plans and rules, about how things would be different. I listened, nodding, but something felt off. They were focused on the future as if it were a clean page, while I was still living in the margin notes. During one visit, my mom reached for my hand and said, "When you come home, we'll do family dinners again, just like before." The words made my stomach knot. Just like before was the problem. I pulled my hand back gently and said, "Before didn't work for me." The supervisor's pen paused on the clipboard. My mom's face fell, confused and hurt, like she couldn't understand why I wouldn't accept a memory as a solution. After that visit, Ms. Lopez asked me if I felt pressured. I nodded. "They want me to forgive so things can move on," I said. "But I don't even know what moving on is supposed to feel like." She told me something important then. "Forgiveness isn't a requirement for safety," she said, "and reconciliation isn't a deadline." Hearing that felt like someone loosening a belt I didn't know was cutting into me. The pressure didn't just come from my parents. Extended family started sending messages again, careful ones this time. They talked about healing and togetherness and how everyone makes mistakes. No one asked what I needed. They asked when I'd be ready. Ready to go back, ready to forgive, ready to stop being the reason things were uncomfortable. One aunt sent a letter saying, "You've always been wise beyond your years. I know you'll do the right thing." The right thing, apparently, was whatever made the adults feel better. I showed the letter to Mrs. Johnson, expecting her to tell me how to respond. She read it quietly, then handed it back. "You don't owe anyone wisdom," she said. "You're allowed to be 11. That sentence hit harder than any courtroom speech. I realized I didn't actually know what being 11 looked like. My childhood had been measured in chores and self-control, in not needing too much. Learning to be a kid felt awkward and unfamiliar, like wearing clothes that didn't quite fit yet. Another problem surfaced when therapy began. The counselor was kind and patient, but the questions stirred things I'd packed away tightly. She asked about the night sounds of the house when I was alone, about what I'd imagined might happen, about who I would have called if something went wrong. Saying those things out loud made them feel real in a way writing hadn't. After one session, I felt raw and exhausted, like my skin was too thin. I snapped at Mrs. Johnson over something small, then immediately felt guilty. She didn't scold me. She just said, "Big feelings come out sideways sometimes." That was another lesson no one had taught me before. At school, a rumor started that my parents were in trouble because of me. A boy in my class said it out loud during lunch. "My mom says you got your parents investigated," he said, not cruelly, just curious. The cafeteria noise faded around us. I felt every eye turned toward me. For a split second, I wanted to shrink and disappear. Then I remembered the notebook, the empty fridge, the video of my own face saying I was still alone. "They got investigated because they left me alone," I said evenly. "I didn't make that happen. They did." The boy nodded slowly like he was processing something new and went back to his lunch. My hands shook under the table, but a strange calm settled over me too. I'd said it without apologizing. That was new. The court requested another update from me before the next review hearing, and this time they asked about my preferences. Did I feel safe? Did I want reunification to remain the goal? Did I have concerns? Having my preferences formally requested felt empowering and terrifying. I worried that saying the wrong thing would make me seem ungrateful or difficult. Ms. Lopez reminded me again that honesty wasn't disrespect. So I told them the truth. I said I felt safer where I was. I said I needed consistency more than promises. I said I wasn't ready to live with my parents again. Writing that down felt like crossing a bridge that might not have a way back. The reaction came quickly. My parents requested an additional supervised visit to clear misunderstandings. During that visit, my dad tried a new approach. He talked about how embarrassed he was, how hard it had been at work, how people looked at him differently now. He said he felt punished. I listened quietly, then said something I hadn't planned. When I was alone, I was scared something bad would happen to me, I said. I didn't tell anyone because I didn't want to get you in trouble. My dad looked startled. You should have told us, he said automatically. I met his eyes. I didn't think you'd come back. The room went silent. The supervisor looked down at her notes. My mom started crying again, but this time it felt different, quieter, less performative. After that visit, I felt a mix of relief and sadness. I'd said something true and important, but it didn't fix anything. It just sat there between us, heavy and undeniable. Another challenge crept in as life began to feel more normal on the surface. Normal was dangerous because it tempted me to minimize what had happened. There were days I thought maybe it wasn't that bad. Maybe I overreacted. Maybe I should just go back and try again. Those thoughts scared me more than the anger ever had. In therapy, I admitted them. The counselor nodded. That's a common response, she said. Your brain is trying to restore what it recognizes as home, even if home wasn't safe. That explanation helped me trust myself a little more. At Mrs. Johnson's, routine settled in. Homework at the table, dinner at 6, a walk after dishes. Predictability felt strange but soothing. One night, as we folded laundry together, she asked me a simple question. What do you want your life to look like in a year? No one had ever asked me that without an agenda. I thought about it seriously. I want to not be scared when I'm hungry, I said. I want to know someone will notice if I'm gone. She smiled softly. Those are good goals. The next court review approached, and with it came the biggest internal conflict yet. My parents were making progress on paper. Classes completed. Counseling sessions attended. Reports filed. The system liked progress. But I wasn't sure progress equaled change. Ms. Lopez asked me again what I wanted to recommend. My throat tightened. This was the moment where my words could tip the scale. I thought about my mom's bright smile at the door, the suitcase rolling away, the fake kiss. I thought about the nights alone and the morning I ate dry cereal for the 3rd day in a row. I also thought about the supervised visits, the effort, the tears. The problem was that wanting my parents to be better didn't mean I was ready to trust them. I told Ms. Lopez that. She listened carefully. Trust rebuilds slower than compliance, she said. The court can take that into account. At the hearing, I spoke again, briefly this time. I said I appreciated the steps my parents were taking. I said I needed more time. I said safety mattered more to me than speed. The judge nodded thoughtfully. The order was adjusted. Supervised visits would continue. Placement would remain the same for now. Reunification was not off the table, but it was not imminent. My parents looked disappointed, but they didn't argue. As we left, my mom whispered, "We'll keep trying." I believed she meant it. I just didn't know if trying would ever be enough. Walking back to Mrs. Johnson's car, I felt exhausted but steady. I hadn't been rushed into forgiveness. I hadn't been forced into pretending. The system hadn't been perfect, but it had listened. That mattered. Later that night, I opened my notebook and wrote something new at the bottom of the page. Not evidence, not documentation, just a sentence. I am allowed to take my time. Closing the notebook, I realized something else. The biggest problem I faced now wasn't abandonment or hunger or silence. It was learning how to live without constantly preparing for the worst. And that might be the hardest lesson of all. Things were calmer now on the surface. No emergency meetings. No strangers knocking on doors. No sudden phone calls that made my heart jump into my throat. Everyone kept saying the same thing. Things are stabilizing. But stability did not mean safety inside my head. It meant space, and in that space my thoughts started circling. I began replaying moments from before my mom left, searching for signs I might have missed, wondering if there was something I could have done differently. That question followed me everywhere. In the shower, on the bus, lying in bed at night, staring at the ceiling. What if I had spoken up sooner? What if I had told a teacher before she left? What if I had tried harder to be the independent kid she wanted? The guilt crept in quietly, wearing logic like armor. At school, my grades slipped for the first time in my life. Not dramatically, but enough for my teacher to ask if I was distracted. I told her I was tired. That was easier than explaining that my brain was constantly checking for danger, even when none was visible. The counselor noticed, too. She explained that once the adrenaline fades, the body often crashes. That trauma does not end when the event ends. It waits until you finally feel safe enough to fall apart. That idea terrified me. I did not want to fall apart. Falling apart felt like losing control, and control was the only thing that had kept me alive that month. At Mrs. Johnson's house, I started double-checking locks before bed, even though the neighborhood was quiet. I counted cans in the pantry, even though it was always full now. I flinched when someone raised their voice on television. Mrs. Johnson noticed all of it. She never called it paranoia. She called it habits that had once protected me. One evening, she asked if I wanted to help her plant flowers in the backyard. I did not see how flowers could help anything, but I went anyway. As we dug into the dirt, she talked casually about weather and seasons and how roots needed time underground before anything showed above the surface. People are like that too, she said. Growth isn't loud. I thought about that later while lying in bed, wondering if healing was supposed to feel quieter than pain. Another issue surfaced when my parents started sending gifts through the department. A hoodie from a city they'd visited. A book, they said, reminded them of me. A necklace with my birthstone. Each item came with a note about love and missing me and wanting to make things right. The first package made me cry. The second made me angry. By the third, I felt numb. The gifts felt like shortcuts, like objects meant to bridge a gap that required effort instead. Ms. Lopez asked how I felt about receiving them. Confused, I said, like they're trying to buy forgiveness without asking what I need. She suggested I write a response, even if I never sent it. So I did. I wrote that gifts didn't fix empty houses, that souvenirs couldn't replace supervision, that love without responsibility felt hollow. Writing it made my chest feel lighter, even if the words stayed private. The supervised visits continued, and with them came a new tactic. My mom began talking about how other parents had it worse, how kids survived harder things, how she'd grown up with less. She wasn't yelling or denying anymore. She was minimizing. Each comparison felt like a small erasure. During one visit, she said, "You weren't really starving. You lost a little weight, that's all." Something in me snapped, quietly but firmly. I was counting meals, I said. I was afraid to eat too much in case I ran out. The supervisor looked up sharply. My mom went silent. Afterward, Ms. Lopez told me that minimizing harm is a common defense. It doesn't mean you imagined it, she said. It means acknowledging it would hurt too much. That helped, but it also made me sad. I did not want to be the thing that hurt my parents just by existing honestly. School brought another complication. A group project required parental signatures, and I froze when I saw the form. I did not know who to put down. Mrs. Johnson offered to sign, but the form asked for legal guardian. Ms. Lopez handled it eventually, but the moment reminded me that my life existed in a gray area now. Not fully with my parents. Not fully separate. In between. That in-between feeling showed up everywhere. At lunch tables, on permission slips, in conversations where people asked casually, "What do your parents think?" I started saying the adults I live with. It felt strange, but accurate. One afternoon, I overheard two teachers talking in the hallway. One said, "She's very composed for what she's been through." The other replied, "Sometimes kids like that crack later." The word crack echoed in my head all day. I did not want to crack. I wanted to bend, to stretch, to adapt. In therapy, I admitted that fear. The counselor said something I wrote down immediately. "You don't break because you feel pain," she said. "You break when you're not allowed to feel it." That changed something in me. I started letting myself cry when I needed to, not hiding it, not apologizing, just letting it happen. Mrs. Johnson would hand me tissues and sit nearby without asking questions. That quiet presence mattered more than advice. The court scheduled another update meeting, and this time my parents brought a therapist with them to demonstrate commitment. The therapist spoke about attachment and mistakes and repair. I listened carefully. When it was my turn, I said something new. "I need consistency before I can think about trust," I said. "I need to know that if something goes wrong, I won't be alone again." The therapist nodded approvingly. My parents looked overwhelmed. For the first time, I realized they were only beginning to understand the depth of what they'd done. That realization did not make me feel better. It made me tired. Healing felt like work I had not signed up for. A new problem appeared when my classmates started treating me differently. Not unkindly, just cautiously, like I was fragile, like one wrong comment might shatter me. I hated that. I wanted to be normal, but I also knew normal had failed me before. One day, I raised my hand in class to argue a point during a discussion. The teacher hesitated before calling on me, like she was checking whether it was safe. That hesitation made my cheeks burn. After class, I told her I wanted to be treated like everyone else. She apologized sincerely. That small victory reminded me that speaking up did not always lead to punishment. Sometimes it led to change. At home, Mrs. Johnson asked if I wanted to decorate my room more permanently. The question scared me. Permanence felt like betrayal, like admitting I might not go back. But it also felt comforting. I chose new curtains and pinned photos on the wall. I planted myself a little deeper. That night, I slept better than I had in months. My parents noticed the shift and reacted with urgency. They requested more frequent visits, longer sessions. They talked about timelines. The system pushed back gently. Progress could not be rushed. I felt caught in the middle again, but this time I knew how to name it. "They're afraid of losing me," I told my counselor, "and I'm afraid of being found again without being protected." She nodded. "Both can be true," she said, "but only one fear gets to decide what happens next." As weeks passed, I started imagining a future that did not revolve around my parents' choices, that felt rebellious and freeing. I thought about high school, about clubs and friends, and dreams that had nothing to do with survival. The thought scared me because it meant letting go of vigilance, but it also gave me hope. One evening, Mrs. Johnson asked me what I wanted to be when I grew up. No one had asked me that without expectation attached. I thought for a long time. "Someone who notices," I said finally. "Someone who doesn't leave." She smiled, eyes soft. "I think you already are." Writing in my notebook changed again. It stopped being about evidence and became about reflection. I wrote questions instead of statements. What does safety feel like? What do I need to believe people? How do I stop blaming myself? Those questions did not have immediate answers, but asking them felt like progress. The biggest challenge of this part of my story was accepting that justice and healing were not the same thing. The system could hold my parents accountable. It could set rules and boundaries, but it could not give me back the sense of being chosen. That was something I had to rebuild myself, piece by piece, with people who showed up consistently. As the next hearing approached, I felt steadier than before. Not healed, not finished, but grounded. I had survived the silence. I had told the truth. And now I was learning how to live in a world where my needs mattered. The problem ahead was no longer about whether my parents would change. It was about whether I would trust myself enough to keep choosing safety, even when it was uncomfortable. And for the first time, I believed I could. People began expecting me to be over it. From the outside, my life looked stable. I had a safe place to live. I was eating regularly. Adults were involved. The emergency was over. And because the emergency was over, the patience around my pain started to thin. Teachers stopped checking in. The counselor shortened our sessions. Friends assumed I was back to normal. But trauma does not follow calendars. It does not end just because paperwork is filed and doors stop slamming. It lingers in small moments, and that was where it began to ambush me. One afternoon in class, a teacher announced a last-minute schedule change. Nothing serious, just a different room for the next period. My chest tightened instantly. My hands went cold. I felt that familiar rush of panic, the same feeling I had when my mom rolled her suitcase toward the door and told me to order food if I needed to. I knew logically that a room change was not abandonment, but my body did not care about logic. It reacted as if something had been taken away again. I excused myself and went to the bathroom, locked myself in a stall, and tried to breathe. That was when I realized a dangerous thought had started forming in my head. Maybe I was broken. Maybe this was who I was now. A kid who flinched at small changes. A kid who could not handle uncertainty. That thought scared me more than hunger ever had. Hunger was physical. This felt like something wrong with me. When I told my therapist, she shook her head immediately. "Your nervous system learned to survive," she said. "It's doing its job too well right now. That doesn't mean it's permanent." She explained that trauma responses often appear strongest after safety returns because the body finally has room to process what it endured. That explanation helped, but it did not erase the fear that people would stop making space for me before I learned how to manage it. That fear became real when one of my teachers pulled me aside and said, "You can't keep leaving class every time you feel overwhelmed. You need to push through." The words were not cruel, but they were dismissive. They sounded like something my mom would have said. I nodded and apologized, but inside something cracked. I went home that day feeling small again, like my pain was inconvenient. Mrs. Johnson noticed immediately. She asked what was wrong, and for once I did not downplay it. I told her everything. The panic, the teacher, the fear that I was too much. She listened carefully and then said something I would carry with me for the rest of my life. People don't get to decide when your healing is done just because it makes them more comfortable. That sentence rearranged something in my chest. The next day, she came with me to school and spoke to the counselor. Not angrily, not accusing, just firmly. They adjusted my plan. I was allowed short breaks without penalty. Teachers were informed discreetly. I did not want special treatment. I wanted reasonable space to recover. That advocacy showed me something important. Needing help did not make me weak. It meant I was learning how to protect myself in ways my parents never did. Meanwhile, my parents' behavior shifted again. The apologies became more polished. They started using therapy language. Words like growth, accountability, and learning curve appeared in their messages. It sounded good on paper, but something felt off. During visits, they focused heavily on how much they were changing instead of asking how I was changing. Every conversation circled back to their effort, their pain, their fear of losing me. I began to feel like their recovery project instead of their child. One visit ended with my mom saying, "We've done everything they asked. You have to see that we're trying." I looked at her and realized something uncomfortable. Trying was new for them. Surviving was not new for me. That imbalance mattered. Later, I told Ms. Lopez that the visits felt performative. She nodded. "Real accountability isn't about proving you're good," she said. "It's about staying present even when you don't get immediate forgiveness." That made sense. I started paying attention not to what my parents said, but to what they tolerated. Could they sit with my anger without rushing to fix it? Could they hear about my fear without defending themselves? Most of the time, the answer was no. Another issue emerged when relatives began pushing reconciliation harder. Now that things looked calmer, they expected closure. Calls came in with phrases like, "Life is short," and "You'll regret holding on to this." No one asked if I regretted being left. They asked if I regretted speaking up. That made me angry in a way I had not felt before. It was not explosive anger. It was sharp and clear. I realized how often kids are expected to absorb harm quietly to preserve adult comfort. I refused to do that anymore. When an aunt told me I should be the bigger person, I replied I was 11. I already was. The call ended shortly after. That boundary felt good. Hard, but good. At school, I started writing again, not in my notebook of evidence, but in a new journal. This one was private. No witnesses. No purpose beyond honesty. I wrote about the month alone, but also about the aftermath. The confusion. The grief. The strange guilt that came with being believed. I wrote about how safety felt unfamiliar, like wearing shoes that did not fit yet. Over time, the entries changed. Less about survival, more about identity. Who was I when I was not proving something? Who was I when no one was watching? Those questions felt big, but they also felt like mine. Mrs. Johnson encouraged me to join an after-school club. I chose writing. Sitting in a room with other kids who loved words felt grounding. We shared stories, some funny, some sad. No one knew my full history, and that anonymity felt freeing. I was not the abandoned kid. I was just a voice. One day, the instructor read one of my pieces out loud. Anonymously, and the room went quiet. When she finished, someone said, "That feels real." I almost cried. Being seen without being exposed was something new. As the next court review approached, anxiety crept back in. Decisions would be made. Futures adjusted. The unknown returned. But this time I was not alone with it. I had adults who explained what might happen. I had a say. That made all the difference. During preparation, the caseworker asked me a question that stopped me cold. What do you want if full reunification is offered? No one had asked me that so directly before. I thought about it for days. I thought about my parents' house, the memories, the silence, the suitcase sound. I thought about Mrs. Johnson's kitchen, the smell of dinner, the way she knocked before entering my room. I thought about how different those spaces made my body feel. When I finally answered, my voice was steady. I want safety before proximity, I said. I don't want to live with people who can leave me again without warning. That answer shaped everything that followed. My parents were not pleased. They felt rejected. They felt punished. But this time, their feelings were not the deciding factor. Mine were. The judge ordered extended temporary placement and continued supervision. My parents were required to attend additional counseling and parenting education. Visits remained supervised. The gavel did not slam dramatically. There was no cinematic moment, just a quiet acknowledgement that trust takes time. Walking out of the building, I felt lighter than I expected. Not happy, not relieved, just aligned. That alignment mattered. Back at Mrs. Johnson's, life continued. Homework, chores, small arguments about bedtime, ordinary things. And in that ordinariness, I healed in ways no apology could offer. One night, I realized I had gone an entire day without checking the pantry. I had not counted meals. I had not monitored my phone for messages. I had simply existed. That realization stunned me. Healing was happening whether I noticed it or not. The problem now was not abandonment. It was learning how to live without constantly preparing for it. That was harder than it sounded. Letting go of vigilance felt risky, like leaving a door unlocked. But slowly I practiced. I laughed more. I slept deeper. I argued without fear of being left. Those were small rebellions against the past. When my mom sent another long message asking if I missed her, I did not respond immediately. I sat with the question and realized something surprising. I missed the idea of a mother more than the reality of the one I had. That truth hurt, but it was honest, and honesty had become my anchor. As part 7 closed, I understood the new challenge ahead. It was not about proving harm anymore. That had been done. It was about building a future where my worth was not measured by how well I survived neglect. It was about choosing relationships that did not require me to disappear to be loved. And for the first time, that future felt possible. Another issue arrived quietly, disguised as progress. It started the day my parents were granted expanded, supervised visits. On paper, it looked like a win. The reports showed compliance, therapy attendance, parenting classes completed, cooperative language. Everyone around me kept saying, "This is good," as if good was the same thing as safe. But something inside me tightened the moment I heard the word expanded. More time meant more opportunity, more chances for things to go wrong in subtle ways that were harder to prove. Hunger had been obvious. Silence had been obvious. Emotional pressure was not. During the first longer visit, my mom hugged me too tightly and whispered, "I've missed you every second." It sounded loving, but it landed like a weight. I had missed having a mother too, but I did not miss being responsible for her feelings. The visit took place in a neutral room with a case aide present, but my mom spoke like the aide was invisible. She talked about how empty the house felt without me, how she cried at night, how she barely slept. She never asked how I slept. My dad sat quietly, nodding along, his eyes fixed on the floor. I noticed something important then. Their pain took up all the oxygen in the room. There was no space left for mine. When the visit ended, I felt exhausted, like I had just finished an exam I did not study for but was still expected to pass. Back at Mrs. Johnson's house, I went straight to my room and shut the door. I did not cry. I did not panic. I just felt hollow. That scared me more than tears would have. Mrs. Johnson knocked and asked if I wanted dinner. I said yes, but my voice sounded far away even to me. That night, I wrote in my private journal, "I am not afraid of them yelling. I am afraid of them needing me." That sentence sat on the page like a warning sign. The therapist helped me name what was happening. Emotional enmeshment. My parents were using vulnerability as a way to pull me back into an old role, the one where I regulated their emotions instead of the other way around. It was not malicious in the obvious sense. It was familiar, and that familiarity made it dangerous. The next visit confirmed it. My mom brought a scrapbook. Photos of me as a baby. Notes she said she had written back then about how much she loved me. She flipped through it, narrating memories like she was rebuilding a case for motherhood. "See," she said, smiling too hard, "I've always loved you." The case aide watched silently. I stared at the photos and felt nothing. Love was not the problem. Reliability was. When I did not react the way she expected, her smile slipped. "You don't even care," she said softly, wounded. The words cut, not because they were true, but because they were manipulative. I glanced at the aide, unsure if this crossed a line. It did not look dramatic enough to stop the visit, but it left a mark. Afterward, I told Ms. Lopez exactly what was said. She nodded and wrote it down. "This is important," she said. "Pressure to manage a parent's emotions is not appropriate." Hearing that validated something I had felt my entire life but never had language for. The problem escalated when my parents began involving extended family again. Suddenly, cousins and grandparents were present at visits, framing them as support. The room filled with voices telling me how much my parents loved me, how much they had learned, how everyone deserved a second chance. No one asked what I needed from that chance. I felt cornered by kindness, that kind of kindness that feels like a demand. During one visit, my grandmother took my hand and said, "Your mother has suffered enough." I pulled my hand back gently and replied, "So have I." The room went silent. That silence felt like power returning to my body. Later, my parents complained that I was being cold. The case aide noted it. I stopped apologizing for boundaries that kept me steady. A new fear surfaced then. What if the system mistook compliance for change? What if the desire to close the case outweighed the reality of my emotional safety? I voiced this fear during a review meeting. The adults exchanged looks. One of them said, "We have to balance reunification goals with child well-being." That word again, balance. I wanted to scream that balance was what left me alone with $20. Instead, I said, calmly, well-being includes not being emotionally pressured to forgive before I'm ready. That sentence shifted the room. They wrote it down. They slowed the process. I learned then that using clear language was another form of protection. At school, things improved, but not without friction. A friend asked why I did not live with my parents anymore. I gave a vague answer. Rumors filled the gaps. Some kids thought I was in trouble. Others thought I was lucky. I did not feel either. I felt like I was rebuilding myself in public without privacy. One day, someone joked, "At least you get 2 houses." I laughed weakly and went to the bathroom to breathe. That night, I told Mrs. Johnson I hated being different. She hugged me and said, "Different is not broken. It just takes longer to explain." I held on to that. Another issue arose when my parents started asking me questions that felt like fishing. "Do you talk about us in therapy? What do they say about us? Do they think we're bad parents?" I stopped answering. I told Ms. Lopez, who advised me to redirect or decline. That felt empowering but also sad. I had learned how to protect myself from my own parents. That realization carried grief. There were moments I wished they would just be angry. Anger would have been easier to reject. This was quieter, sneakier. It wrapped itself in concern. During one visit, my mom said, "If you come home, we can all heal together." I looked at her and asked, "What happens if you need another break?" She did not answer. The silence answered for her. I documented that moment later, not as evidence this time, but as clarity. The system extended temporary placement again. My parents protested. They said I was being influenced, that I had been turned against them. I listened and realized something else had changed. Their words no longer defined me. They described themselves. That was progress I could feel. The new problem then became patience. How long would this take? How long could I live between worlds? How long before a decision became permanent? Uncertainty pressed on me again, but it did not suffocate me like before. I had learned how to ask questions. I had learned how to say no. Those skills became my anchors. One evening, I sat at Mrs. Johnson's table doing homework while she read nearby. The quiet was comfortable. I realized I was not waiting for something to go wrong. That absence of vigilance felt like a milestone. Healing was not dramatic. It was boring, and boring felt safe. As Part 8 closed, the conflict was no longer about abandonment. It was about identity. Who was I if I was not the child left behind? Who was I if I did not have to prove harm to be protected? That question lingered, unresolved, and it would shape the next phase of my life. Then something disguised as relief that made it harder to recognize. It started when the court scheduled a permanency hearing. Everyone framed it as clarity, a decision point, an end to limbo. But clarity cuts both ways. It forces choices, and choices mean something has to be lost. Until then, I had lived in a strange in-between where I could grow without fully severing anything. The hearing threatened to collapse that space. For the first time since everything began, I felt fear that was not about my parents hurting me, but about me hurting them by choosing myself. That distinction mattered. The therapist noticed it before I did. During one session, she asked, "What scares you most about the hearing?" I opened my mouth to say something about safety or stability, but what came out was, "What if they never forgive me?" The room went quiet. She did not rush to reassure me. She let the silence do its work. Then she said, "Forgiveness is not something you owe in exchange for safety." I nodded, but the words did not fully sink in yet. My parents intensified their efforts as the date approached. Not with anger, but with nostalgia. They talked about holidays, traditions, plans they had put on hold for me. My dad mentioned a camping trip we used to take when I was little, framing it like a promise. My mom talked about repainting my room, as if the right color could erase the past. Each memory was a thread, and together they formed a net. I felt myself slipping into old patterns, smiling politely, offering non-committal answers. After one visit, I caught myself rehearsing how I would make things easier for them if I went home. That scared me. I told Ms. Lopez the next day. She listened carefully and said, "That's important information. It tells us the pressure is still there." The word pressure grounded me. This was not love expressed freely. It was expectation dressed as affection. The problem deepened when my parents' lawyer requested that I write a letter to the court expressing my wishes. On the surface, that sounded empowering. My voice mattered, but the timing and framing felt off. The letter would become a tool, and I did not trust whose hands it would end up in. I asked if I could wait. The answer was no. Deadlines do not wait for feelings. I sat at the kitchen table with a blank page and felt the weight of every possible interpretation. If I wrote that I wanted to stay where I was, would that be seen as betrayal? If I wrote that I was open to reunification, would that erase everything I had learned to protect myself? The pen felt heavy. I remembered the first notebook. Evidence. That notebook had been about survival. This letter was about direction. I realized I needed to write the truth, not a verdict. So I wrote slowly, carefully. I wrote that I felt safe where I was. I wrote that I needed more time. I wrote that love alone did not make a home. I wrote that I wanted my parents to continue therapy regardless of where I lived. I did not write a promise. I wrote a boundary. When I finished, I felt drained but steady. The letter went into an envelope, and I did not ask who read it next. Another problem surfaced at school. A teacher pulled me aside and said she admired my maturity. The word hit wrong. Maturity had been the excuse used to abandon me. I smiled, thanked her, then later explained gently why that label made me uncomfortable. She listened, apologized, and adjusted. That interaction mattered. It showed me that people could change when given information, not just consequences. It also highlighted something painful. My parents had been given information for years. They had chosen differently. The week before the hearing, my mom called through the case office and asked to speak to me privately. The request was denied, but the message came through anyway. She said she felt like she was losing me. That sentence echoed in my head. Losing implies ownership. I realized then that part of what scared them was not just the case, but the shift in power. I was no longer someone they could decide for without question. That shift was irreversible. On the day of the hearing, the courthouse smelled like disinfectant and old paper. I sat beside Ms. Lopez, my feet not quite touching the floor. My parents sat across the room. They looked smaller there, stripped of the casual authority of home. When the judge asked me if I wanted to speak, my heart raced, but I said yes. I did not look at my parents. I looked at the judge and said, clearly, that I was not ready to go back. I said I needed consistency. I said I was afraid of being left again. I said I was learning what safety felt like, and I was not willing to trade that for promises. The judge listened without interrupting. When my parents' lawyer cross-examined gently, asking if I loved my parents, I answered honestly, yes. Love was never the issue. The issue was care. The ruling did not end everything. It extended placement and set conditions. More therapy, more observation, no immediate reunification. The judge said something that stayed with me. Trust is rebuilt through time and behavior, not intention. As we left the courthouse, my parents looked devastated. I felt a pang of guilt, sharp and sudden. Mrs. Johnson squeezed my hand and said quietly, "You did the right thing." I wanted to believe her without reservation. The aftermath was quieter. No dramatic fallout, just a new normal. My parents went radio silent for a while, advised by counsel. That silence was different from before. It did not feel like abandonment. It felt like distance with boundaries. I focused on school, on friends, on small routines. One night, I realized I had gone an entire day without thinking about the case. That felt like progress. Then a new problem emerged, internal this time. Who would I be if reunification never happened? The question crept in at night. I grieved not just my parents as they were, but the version of them I had hoped for. That grief needed space. Therapy became the place where I could admit that wanting distance did not mean wanting harm. It meant wanting health. My therapist said something that reframed everything. Sometimes the bravest thing a child can do is stop trying to fix adults. That sentence released a pressure I had carried unconsciously. I stopped scanning my parents' progress like a report card. I let their journey be theirs. The final complication of this phase came unexpectedly. My mom sent a message through the case office acknowledging, for the first time, that leaving me alone was wrong. No excuses, no qualifiers, just an apology. It was short. It was imperfect. It did not ask for anything. I read it several times. I felt relief, then anger that it had taken so long, then sadness that an apology did not undo the damage. I showed it to my therapist. She asked how I felt. I said, "I'm glad she said it, but I'm not ready to change anything." She nodded. "You're allowed to accept words without rearranging your life around them." That felt like another lesson earned the hard way. As part 9 closed, the story shifted again. The danger was no longer immediate neglect. It was the pull of resolution before readiness. The risk was choosing peace too early and calling it healing. I learned that safety was not just about where I slept, but about who I did not have to manage anymore. The next chapter would test whether patience could hold against pressure, and whether time would reveal change or repetition. The next problem did not come from my parents or the court. It came from something quieter and more dangerous: normalcy. Life at Mrs. Johnson's house started to feel routine. School, dinner, homework, weekends with chores and small treats like movie nights or pancakes on Sunday mornings. No yelling, no sudden disappearances, no feeling like I had to earn the right to exist. And that scared me more than chaos ever had. Because normal made the past feel unreal, like something I could minimize if I wanted to. I caught myself thinking, maybe it wasn't that bad. Maybe I overreacted. That thought was the real threat. Trauma does that. It rewrites itself when the danger is gone. My therapist warned me about it, but knowing didn't stop it from happening. One afternoon, after a perfectly ordinary day, I stood in the bathroom brushing my teeth and suddenly burst into tears. Not quiet crying, the kind that shakes your chest and surprises you with how loud it is. Mrs. Johnson knocked immediately and asked what was wrong. I couldn't answer, because nothing was wrong, and everything was. That night, I admitted something I hadn't said out loud yet. If things feel okay now, it makes me feel guilty for what happened before. She sat beside me and said something that shifted the ground under my feet. Feeling safe doesn't erase the harm. It proves it was real. The problem deepened when reunification planning meetings began again. Professionals love plans, timelines, milestones, measurable goals. On paper, my parents were improving. Therapy attendance, parenting classes, supervised visits without incidents. The system started to lean toward progress. Progress is good, but it can also be rushed. The caseworker asked how I felt about increasing visit frequency. I hesitated. I didn't feel unsafe during visits, but I felt invisible afterward, like I disappeared again once the hour ended. That invisibility was familiar. Familiarity is not comfort. It is habit. I said I wasn't ready. The response was careful but clear. We need to consider long-term outcomes. Long-term outcomes for who? That question stayed with me. At school, a new social problem emerged. A classmate mentioned seeing my mom's social media post about fighting to get her daughter back. The wording bothered me. Fighting implied a battle with a villain, not a process of repair. I worried about the story being rewritten publicly. I asked Ms. Lopez if that mattered. She said perception always matters, especially when it pressures a child to perform reconciliation. Another layer of pressure I didn't need. The next visit with my parents felt different. My mom tried too hard. Compliments, gifts, exaggerated enthusiasm. My dad stayed quiet, nodding along. Halfway through, my mom said, "When you come home, we'll do things differently." The phrase, "when you come home," landed wrong. It assumed a conclusion I had not agreed to. My chest tightened. I corrected her calmly. If I said, the room shifted. Her smile faltered. She said nothing, but the silence spoke. Afterward, I felt shaky. Not because anything bad happened, but because I had asserted a boundary and survived it. That was new. The next problem surfaced in therapy. I realized I did not know what I wanted independent of reacting to my parents. Did I want to stay permanently with Mrs. Johnson? Did I want foster placement elsewhere? Did I want reunification someday? All my answers felt like responses, not desires. My therapist asked me to imagine a future without my parents' expectations involved. That exercise broke me open. I had never been asked that. I cried again, quietly this time. The truth was, I wanted stability without negotiation. I wanted to stop being the hinge everyone swung on. As the permanency review approached, my parents' compliance report looked strong. The professionals spoke in cautious optimism. I felt the old pattern rising. Adults deciding what was best without fully listening to how it felt. I prepared myself to speak again. Not dramatically, clearly. On the day of the meeting, I said something that surprised even me. Progress doesn't mean trust, I said. Trust needs consistency when no one is watching. The room went quiet. One of the evaluators nodded slowly. Another wrote something down. My parents looked stunned. I wasn't attacking them. I was describing reality. That difference mattered. After the meeting, my dad asked through the caseworker if I would consider writing him a letter. Not for the court. Just for him. I thought about it for days. Writing had power for me. But power can be misused. I agreed on one condition. The letter would not ask for anything. It would explain. I wrote about the silence of the house, about the fridge, about the word independent, about how being praised for maturity felt like being abandoned with a bow on it. I did not accuse. I described. When I finished, I felt empty and relieved. The letter was sent. I did not ask for a response. A week later, my dad sent one back. It was awkward, halting, but it acknowledged harm without deflection. That mattered. My mom did not respond. That also mattered. Another issue emerged with extended family. An aunt reached out saying she missed me and wanted to help. I liked her, but I had learned that access is not the same as safety. I asked for supervised contact first. She agreed without protest. That told me something important. Respect is revealed when boundaries are accepted, not challenged. School projects started asking about family. I chose my words carefully. I stopped lying. I said I lived with a neighbor while my parents worked on things. The truth was simpler than excuses. My teacher accepted it without drama. That felt like a small victory. The biggest internal shift came one evening while doing homework. I realized I wasn't waiting anymore. Not for apologies. Not for outcomes. Not for decisions. I was living. That realization scared me, because it meant whatever happened next, I would be okay. The permanency recommendation came soon after. Continued placement. Gradual evaluation. No rushed reunification. The system had listened. Not perfectly, but enough. My parents were disappointed. I felt relief, mixed with grief. Both could exist. In therapy, We talked about holding conflicting emotions without forcing resolution. That skill felt adult in the healthiest way, not independence by neglect, but autonomy by understanding. As part 10 closed, the stakes changed again. The danger was no longer overt neglect or immediate reunification. It was subtle erosion. The risk of being pulled back by guilt, nostalgia, or the desire to make things easier for everyone else. I learned that healing was not a straight line toward forgiveness. It was a boundary that moved only when safety moved with it. The next part would test whether time would deepen change or simply soften memory, and whether I could keep choosing myself even when the world grew quieter. Time kept moving, and with every week that passed, the urgency faded for everyone except me. Systems are built to respond to crisis, not to the long echo after it. Phone calls from professionals became less frequent. Meetings shortened. The language shifted from concern to monitoring. That change carried a risk. When attention softens, old patterns sneak back in quietly. My parents started sending carefully worded updates through the caseworker. Not apologies, not demands, just progress reports dressed up as care. Therapy sessions attended, journals kept, books read. It all sounded responsible, and maybe it was. But responsibility performed is not the same as responsibility lived. During one supervised visit, my mom said, "I'm learning so much about myself," and waited for reassurance. I didn't give it. Silence filled the room, heavy and awkward. She looked hurt, then annoyed. The problem wasn't that she wanted validation. It was that she wanted it before I felt safe enough to offer it. Afterward, I felt shaky again, that old mix of guilt and strength colliding in my chest. I told my therapist, and she nodded, saying something that stayed with me. Growth that requires applause isn't finished growing. Another problem surfaced at school during a class discussion about summer plans. Kids talked about vacations, family trips, freedom. The word freedom stuck in my head like a splinter. That was the word my mom used before she left me alone. I raised my hand and asked a question instead of sharing a plan. What if freedom for adults means danger for kids? The class went quiet. The teacher handled it gently, turning it into a discussion about responsibility. But afterward, a classmate asked if I was okay. I realized my story was seeping out even when I didn't intend it to. That wasn't necessarily bad, but it meant I had to decide how visible I was willing to be. Visibility can protect you, but it can also invite pressure. Around the same time, my mom requested an unsupervised phone call. The request came with assurances and promises. I asked for time to think. That pause mattered. I learned that saying "not yet" was different from saying no, and that difference gave me control without cruelty. When I agreed to the call with supervision nearby, my mom cried. Real tears, not performative ones. She said she missed me. I believed her. Missing someone does not equal being safe for them. That distinction felt cruel but necessary. She asked if I could forgive her. Forgiveness is a word adults love because it sounds like an ending. I answered honestly, I don't know yet. The silence that followed was uncomfortable, but it was truthful. After the call, I felt drained, like I'd run a long race without moving. The problem was not the conversation itself. It was the expectation that a single emotional exchange could undo sustained harm. Healing doesn't work like that. Another issue arose when my dad tried to step into the role of mediator. He sent messages through the caseworker saying he understood if I was angry with my mom, but hoped I wouldn't punish him too. That framing bothered me. I wasn't punishing anyone. I was protecting myself. I wrote back a short response, clear and calm. This isn't about sides. It's about safety and consistency. He replied with a thank you and nothing else. That restraint told me something. Maybe he was learning to listen without fixing, or maybe he was stepping back. Either way, the space felt better. Mrs. Johnson noticed changes in me before I did. She said I was sleeping through the night more often, laughing without checking myself, eating without rushing. Those were signs of safety settling in. But safety can feel boring when you're used to chaos. I caught myself creating problems in my head, replaying conversations, anticipating conflicts that hadn't happened. My therapist called it vigilance fatigue. When you've had to watch for danger, your body doesn't know how to rest. The solution wasn't more control. It was more trust in myself. The permanency hearing loomed closer, and with it a new fear. What if the court decided that enough time had passed and it was time to go home? The thought made my stomach twist. I wasn't against the idea of someday rebuilding a relationship, but the idea of returning to that house without guarantees felt like stepping onto thin ice. I prepared a statement, not to accuse, but to clarify. I practiced saying it out loud until my voice stopped shaking. On the day of the hearing, I sat straighter than before. When asked how I felt, I didn't narrate pain. I narrated needs, predictability, accountability, support that didn't disappear when it was inconvenient. I watched the adults in the room respond differently to that language. Needs are harder to argue with than emotions. Afterward, the recommendation remained the same. Continued placement, gradual review, no forced reunification. Relief washed through me, followed by sadness. Even when decisions go your way, they can hurt. My parents looked tired. Not angry, not defiant, just worn. That mattered too. I didn't feel victorious. I felt steady. Another complication emerged from an unexpected place. My mom started posting vague messages online about accountability and learning from mistakes. People commented with support, encouragement, praise. I felt a familiar tightening. Public redemption without private repair felt hollow. I asked the caseworker if that mattered. She said it could, especially if it put pressure on me. She offered to set boundaries around online references to the case. That support felt validating. It wasn't about silencing my parents. It was about protecting my space. During a later, supervised visit, my mom referenced those posts, saying she was trying to be transparent. I told her calmly that transparency with strangers didn't substitute for reliability with me. She looked surprised, then quiet. That moment felt important. It was the first time I saw her absorb something without immediately defending herself. Maybe that was progress. Maybe it wasn't. Either way, I didn't have to decide. I learned that uncertainty didn't have to be resolved on anyone else's timeline. Another test came when extended family asked to include me in a holiday gathering. The invitation came with assurances that my parents would behave. I declined, not angrily, simply honestly. I wasn't ready. The family accepted it without pushing. That response felt like respect, and respect builds trust. Slowly, at school, I started a small project about documenting experiences through writing. My teacher encouraged me to submit a piece to a youth journal. I hesitated. Sharing my story publicly felt risky, but I realized something. I wasn't sharing to expose my parents. I was sharing to validate myself. I wrote anonymously, focusing on the feeling of being left, not the details. When the piece was accepted, I felt something lift. My voice had value beyond the case. That mattered. One evening, Mrs. Johnson asked if I wanted to redecorate the guest room. The word guest caught my attention. Was I still a guest? She corrected herself gently. Your room, she said. That small shift carried weight. Belonging is built from details. As part 11 closed, the central problem wasn't neglect or confrontation anymore. It was integration. How to carry what happened without letting it define everything. How to remain open without being exposed. How to allow growth without surrendering boundaries. I understood then that the final challenge wouldn't be a dramatic showdown. It would be the quiet choice to keep honoring myself when no one was watching, when praise was tempting, when reconciliation looked easy. The next part would bring the question to its sharpest edge. Not whether my parents had changed enough, but whether I trusted myself enough to decide what came next and live with it. After months of hearings, supervised visits, reports, and carefully measured steps, The system reached a place where it could no longer decide for me. The professionals did their jobs. The adults around me stabilized the chaos. Safety became consistent. And then the question shifted from what happened to what happens next. My parents completed every requirement placed in front of them. Classes finished. Evaluations passed. Apologies rehearsed and delivered with the right words. On paper, they were ready. On paper, reunification was possible. But paper does not live in your chest. The court asked for my preference, not as a formality, but as a weight-bearing choice. That was the moment the stakes became real in a new way. If I said yes, the story would bend toward reconciliation. If I said no, the distance would harden into something longer, maybe permanent. Both paths carried loss. There was no clean ending, only a true one. In the days leading up to my decision, I paid attention to my body more than my thoughts. When I imagined returning to that house, my shoulders tightened and my breath shortened. When I imagined staying where I was, my chest stayed open, but my heart ached. Safety felt calm. Love felt complicated. I learned that wanting someone does not mean trusting them. That difference mattered. During one final supervised visit, my mom asked me what I needed to come home. The question sounded reasonable, but it carried a trap. It placed the responsibility for repair on me. I answered carefully, I need consistency without supervision. I need you to show up when it's boring and hard, not just when someone is watching. She nodded, promised, cried. I believed she meant it. Meaning it did not erase what had already happened. My dad spoke less, listened more. He apologized without qualifiers. That mattered too. Still, apologies are bridges, not destinations. The night before my statement was due, Mrs. Johnson asked if I wanted to practice saying it out loud. We sat at the kitchen table, the same table where I had once written evidence in block letters. I read my words slowly without drama. I said I appreciated the work my parents had done. I said I loved them. I said love did not undo fear. I said I was not ready to return to their care yet. Saying yet mattered. It was not a punishment. It was a boundary with room for growth. Mrs. Johnson did not clap or reassure me. She simply nodded and said, "That sounds like you." On the day of the hearing, the room felt smaller than before. Familiar faces, familiar procedures, fewer surprises. When it was my turn, I spoke clearly. I did not describe hunger or loneliness again. I described trust. I said trust had been broken, and trust takes time to rebuild. I said I felt safe where I was, and that safety allowed me to grow. I asked to remain where growth was happening. The judge listened without interruption. My parents watched me with expressions I could not fully read. Maybe grief, maybe understanding, maybe both. The ruling honored my request. Continued placement, ongoing review, space to reassess later. It was not a forever decision. It was a for now decision. For the first time, for now felt powerful instead of uncertain. Outside the courtroom, my mom hugged me carefully, as if afraid to break something fragile. She said she was proud of me. I did not respond right away. Pride had always come late in my family, usually after damage. I thanked her for trying. That was the truth. Trying matters. It just does not automatically earn access. Over the following weeks, life settled into a rhythm that felt like mine. School projects, dinners that happened at regular times, evenings that did not require vigilance. I stopped recording videos, not because I forgot, but because I no longer needed proof to feel real. My notebook closed, not as denial, but as completion. I kept it, though. Some truths are not meant to be erased, only integrated. My parents continued supervised visits. Some went well. Some felt heavy. I learned to leave early when my chest tightened, to speak up when a comment crossed a line, to say, "We can try again another day," without guilt. Those skills were new muscles, and they grew with use. One afternoon, my mom asked if I was angry with her. I thought carefully before answering. I was, I said. Now I'm more focused on being okay. She nodded, tears in her eyes, and did not argue. That felt like progress. Another problem resolved itself quietly. The urge to punish faded. Not because I forgave everything, but because punishment kept me tied to the moment of harm. I did not need revenge anymore. The truth had already done its work. Consequences had already unfolded. What remained was choice. I chose stability. I chose honesty without cruelty. I chose boundaries that could flex without breaking. At school, my writing project was published under a pseudonym. A teacher told me it resonated with other kids. That mattered more than I expected. My story had moved beyond me. It was no longer just evidence. It was connection. Mrs. Johnson and I celebrated small things. A good report card, a finished book, a meal cooked together without instruction. Those moments were not dramatic, but they were solid. Belonging built itself, quietly, the way strong things often do. As summer approached, my parents asked about a short, unsupervised outing. A walk, an ice cream. I said yes with conditions. Time limited. Public place. Check in after. They agreed without protest. The walk happened. It was awkward and gentle and uneventful. That was good. Uneventful meant safe. Afterward, I felt tired but not shaken. I reported back honestly. The system noted it. Trust earned a small deposit, not a withdrawal. Looking back, the biggest shift was internal. I stopped asking whether my parents loved me. I started asking whether I loved myself enough to protect my future. That question guided everything. It made decisions clearer, even when they were hard. In the end, there was no dramatic final scene, no shouted confessions, no cinematic justice. There was a girl who learned that independence is not being left alone. It is having the power to choose safety. There was a mother who learned that freedom, without responsibility, costs more than any plane ticket. There was a house that stayed quiet, not because someone was missing, but because peace had moved in. When people ask me now what happened that summer, I tell them this. I learned that telling the truth is not betrayal. It is survival. I learned that adults do not automatically get access to you just because they created you. They earn it by showing up when it matters. And I learned that sometimes the bravest ending is not reconciliation or rejection, but a steady middle ground where you keep growing while everyone else catches up. If you were 11 and left behind with $20 and a promise that you were independent, what would you do when the world finally asked you what you wanted next? I chose myself, and that choice is the one thing no one can ever take from me.